On the day my husband passed, my son sat across from me at the small kitchen table, his voice steady in a way that didn't match the grief still settling over the house. "Mom, did you ever get the papers about the property he transferred to you?" he asked. The question fell between us like a stone dropped into still water. I looked at him, then at the mug cooling in my hands. "What papers?" I asked quietly. His wife stepped into the doorway at that exact moment, her expression tightening for just a breath before she arranged it into something neutral. I didn't answer anything else after that. Not out of fear, out of instinct. Something was off, and I needed to understand what was happening before I said even one wrong word. "I'm glad to have you here. Stay with me until the end and tell me where you're watching from." The living room felt strangely hollow without Michael's presence. The sunlight coming through the tall windows showed the thin layer of dust I hadn't had the heart to wipe away yet. His reading glasses were still on the armrest, sitting exactly where he placed them that last evening. I'd spent the morning moving slowly through the house, touching the back of his chair, smoothing the fold of the blanket he always used, listening to a silence that felt too permanent. I wasn't expecting visitors, much less questions about paperwork I had never seen. But the shift in my daughter-in-law's posture, her shoulders going stiff, her hand tightening on her phone, told me the question wasn't innocent. My son kept talking, half-heartedly explaining something about transfers and final arrangements. But he wouldn't quite meet my eyes. The same young man who once cried into my sweater after scraping his knee now spoke to me like someone delivering a reminder rather than a comfort. I noticed details I had overlooked in recent months, how she'd begun addressing me with a tone that hovered on the edge of impatience, how they'd started arriving late to family dinners or skipping them entirely, how she always hovered near him when finances were mentioned, as if guarding something. Each moment had seemed small at the time, hardly worth noting while I was caring for a husband fading day by day. But now, with my son asking about documents I'd never seen, those little moments began to string themselves together in a line that pointed towards something I didn't yet understand. I sat there, hands folded, keeping my breathing steady as he stumbled through his explanation. His wife kept watching me, her eyes narrowing each time I said I hadn't received anything. She didn't speak, not then, but she didn't need to. Her silence spoke clearly enough. And that was when the first real thought settled in my mind. Not fear, not anger, but clarity. Something was being hidden from me. Something Michael might have intended for me alone, and someone in this house didn't want me to know about it. The morning after that conversation, the house felt heavier than it had the day before. I moved through it slowly, almost cautiously, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The sunlight came in pale through the windows, touching the edges of the picture frames Michael had hung so carefully over the years. I stood there for a long moment, tracing the outline of his handwriting on the small notes he used to leave me on the fridge. It was strange how grief could sit quietly in one corner of a room while suspicion settled in another. I made coffee the way he liked it, even though the cup was mine alone now. The steam rose in thin curls, disappearing into the quiet. I kept replaying my son's question from the night before, his confusion, his hesitation, the way he kept glancing at his wife as though waiting for her approval before saying anything further. That wasn't like him. Not the boy I raised. Not the young man who once apologized for every small mistake, even when he'd done nothing wrong. But yesterday, when I asked what papers he meant, he hesitated just long enough for the truth to show through the cracks. He knew something I didn't. Or worse, he thought I knew something they were afraid of. I walked into the living room, touching the arm of Michael's chair again. A habit now. A way to remind myself that I wasn't imagining the change in the air. He and I had lived modestly on the outside, an old brick house, a quiet neighbourhood, our routines simple and predictable. No one but him ever knew about the investments he watched every morning, the calls he took with a tone I learned meant something serious, the folders he kept locked, the envelopes addressed only to me. I sat down on the edge of the sofa, listening to the old clock above the fireplace tick softly. The house had never felt threatening before. But now every sound seemed to carry a question. Why had my daughter-in-law stiffened when she heard my answer? Why had my son looked relieved when I pretended not to understand what he'd been asking? I tried to tell myself it was grief, that we were all unsteady, saying things we didn't fully mean, but the truth lingered. Quiet, steady, undeniable. She had been waiting for Michael to pass. She had been waiting for something to fall neatly into her hands. And whatever she expected, it clearly hadn't included me knowing anything about documents or transfers. I opened the small drawer of the console table and pulled out the planner Michael bought me last year. He liked the leather one with the clean pages, always insisting it helped keep a calm mind. I flipped through it slowly, scanning dates, notes, scribbles I barely remembered writing. Nothing about property, nothing about accounts. But tucked in the back pocket was a single card with the name of his attorney, the one he had trusted for more than 2 decades. I held it between my fingers, feeling the weight of it. Michael didn't keep unnecessary things. If his attorney's card was tucked away in my planner, he put it there for a reason. Outside, a car door slammed. I froze. Then I heard the familiar rhythm of footsteps, my daughter-in-law's, sharp and quick across the front porch. I didn't move. I listened as she tested the doorknob before knocking twice, firm and impatient. I set the card back into the planner and closed it quietly. Whatever she wanted this morning, I wasn't ready to give her anything. Not fear, not answers, not information she believed she already owned. I stood, smoothing the front of my sweater, letting my breath settle into something steady. If she expected an old woman who didn't know anything, she was about to be disappointed. When I finally opened the door, she didn't bother with a smile. She stepped inside, as if the house already belonged to her, her eyes scanning the living room, lingering on Michael's chair, on the quiet that still held his shape. "You weren't answering your phone," she said, her voice cool, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. I hadn't heard it ring. Or maybe I had, and chose not to. Either way, she was here now, standing in the middle of the room as if waiting for me to confess something. "I was making coffee," I said. She glanced at the cup on the table, then at me, as if measuring the distance between the two. "Right?" she murmured, but the word was edged with something sharp. She walked around slowly, touching the back of the sofa, the corner of the console table, pausing at the photographs of Michael and me. Her fingers hovered over the glass, but never quite touched it. "So," she began, her tone shifting into something falsely gentle. "About yesterday, the paperwork he mentioned." I watched her carefully. The way her eyes tightened when she said paperwork. The way she didn't sit, choosing instead to stand above me like someone expecting a problem that needed solving. "I already told him," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I haven't received anything." She inhaled sharply, just once, barely audible, but enough for me to know she wasn't expecting that answer. "Well," she said, "it must have been misplaced. These things happen when people get overwhelmed." She didn't say the word she wanted to. Older. Forgetful. Unaware. But it sat in the space between us anyway. I picked up my coffee again, letting the warmth steady my hands. "Did you need something?" I asked. She blinked, surprised I hadn't asked for clarification. "Your son and I just want to make sure everything is in order," she said. "I mean, we're all trying to move forward after what happened. If there are documents you're supposed to sign, it's better to handle them early." There it was, the purpose of her visit. She wasn't here to check on me. She wasn't here because she cared about how I was coping or whether I had eaten. She was here to see how close she could get to whatever she thought Michael had left behind. I didn't answer her. Not directly. I simply asked, "Did Michael ever tell you about any transfers?" Her expression faltered for the smallest fraction of a second, a tightening around the jaw, a flicker in her eyes. It was gone quickly, replaced by the kind of smile people use when they think they're still winning. "Oh, he mentioned things," she said lightly. "Mostly about the house, and how you wouldn't want the burden of handling too much on your own." I looked at her, really looked. She was younger than my son by a couple of years, polished in a way that came from effort rather than upbringing. She spoke as if she were already accustomed to deciding things for other people, as if she believed she was entitled to the future she'd imagined for herself. "I'm managing fine," I said. She tilted her head. "Are you?" The clock ticked behind us. A car passed outside, its engine fading into the distance. She waited for me to justify myself, to defend my competence, but I didn't give her that power. I placed my cup down and folded my hands in my lap. Her confidence slipped just a little. She took a step back, reassessing. "Well," she said finally, "your son will stop by later. There are things we need to go over, important things." I nodded once. "Of course." She stared at me a moment longer, trying to read something she couldn't find. Then she walked to the door, her heels tapping sharply on the floor. Before stepping out, she paused. "It's best for everyone if we keep things simple," she said. Simple. Yes, she wanted simple, but simple for her meant silence from me. I closed the door behind her and let the quiet settle again. Not heavy this time. Clear. The card from Michael's attorney was still tucked inside my planner. I opened it, running my thumb along the embossed letter of his name. Michael hadn't kept many secrets from me, but the ones he did were never careless. I set the planner on the table, right beside my cooling cup of coffee. If they wanted a simple story, they were about to find out I had a very different one to tell. That afternoon passed more slowly than any I could remember. I stayed close to the front windows, watching the street without really meaning to, listening for the sound of my son's car. I wasn't sure whether I hoped he would come alone or bring her with him. Either way, the conversation was coming, and pretending otherwise didn't change a thing. I moved through the house with a cloth in my hand, wiping surfaces that didn't need wiping, straightening frames that were already straight. Grief had its own weight, but this new awareness sat differently. It sharpened the air. It made every forgotten detail from the past year return with clearer edges. The time she insisted on handling Michael's medications, the way she accidentally misplaced my mail, the calls from the bank I never received because she said they were wrong numbers. And my son, he had changed too. Not cruel, not intentionally dismissive, just distant in a way I hadn't noticed while I was busy tending to hospital rooms and long nights. He leaned on her for everything. Even the way he spoke to me now ran through her filter. I stopped in front of a photograph of Michael at Lake Michigan, laughing at something I'd said. His eyes were bright, alive, steady. And I remembered the quiet evening when he first told me, almost shyly, that he had put certain assets in my name for later. I didn't know the full extent then. I still didn't. But he'd squeezed my hand with that familiar certainty, the one that always meant he had thought everything through. He had trusted me to handle it, but he had not trusted them. A knock sounded at the door, soft, hesitant, not hers. My son. I opened it, and he stood there with his hands shoved in his jacket pockets, eyes tired, shoulders slightly hunched. He stepped inside slowly, glancing around as if the house felt unfamiliar. "Mom," he said, "we should talk." I nodded and sat across from him at the kitchen table. The same table where he had eaten cereal every morning before school, swinging his feet because they didn't reach the floor yet. Now he wouldn't look directly at me. "About the paperwork," he began. "Dad told me, well, he mentioned things, that there were transfers he wanted done, but he didn't explain everything." "Did he tell you what they were?" I asked. He hesitated. "Not exactly, but she thinks he may have meant the house or other assets. And if there are documents missing, we need to find them. It's important that everything gets settled correctly." There it was, that gentle, practiced voice used when he thought he was being reasonable. He didn't see the strings attached to his words, the ones she'd tied around him over the years, thread by thread. I folded my hands on the table. "Your father handled his affairs carefully," I said. "He didn't leave loose ends." My son shifted. "I know, but you've been under a lot of stress. Maybe something got misplaced, or maybe you signed something and don't remember. It happens when..." He stopped himself, but the damage was done. "When you're older, when you're overwhelmed, when you're not capable." The implication hung there between us. I looked at him steadily, letting the silence answer for me. He had always been uncomfortable with silence. Even now, he fidgeted, glancing at the living room as if hoping she would walk in and take over. "She said you told her some documents were missing," he added carefully. "I told her nothing was missing," I replied. "I simply said I hadn't received anything." That startled him. He looked up, eyes narrowing slightly. "She said..." "I know what she said." He exhaled, confused now, the narrative he'd been fed unraveling just enough for doubt to slip in. I reached for the planner on the counter, not opening it, just resting my hand on it. The attorney's card inside felt like a secret heartbeat. "Your father trusted me," I said softly. "He knew what he was doing." My son studied me, searching for something he had forgotten how to see. Strength, clarity, awareness, maybe even ownership. Before he could respond, another car door slammed outside. Her, back again. He stood quickly, almost relieved. "We'll figure this out together, Mom," he said. But the moment he stepped toward the door, the truth settled fully inside me. He wasn't protecting me. He was protecting the story she had fed him. And whatever they thought they were about to settle, they had no idea how wrong they were. When she walked back into the house without knocking, my son stepped aside automatically, as if her presence filled whatever space he vacated. She gave him a quick glance, one that told him to stay quiet, then turned her attention to me. Her smile was thin, polite only in shape. "We should all sit down," she said. "There are things we need to clarify." I stayed where I was, hands resting calmly on the table. She didn't like that. She preferred movement, preferably mine, so she could guide it. She walked toward the kitchen slowly, scanning the surfaces again, looking for folders, envelopes, anything she believed she was entitled to find. "Your husband tried to leave things in order," she continued, "but unfortunately there were gaps, and those gaps affect the whole family." The whole family. She always used that phrase when she meant herself. My son stood behind her, uncertain, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His eyes met mine briefly, but he looked away just as quickly. He wasn't ready to question her. Not yet. She placed both hands on the back of the chair across from me, leaning forward as though she were addressing a stubborn child. "If there are documents you've misplaced, it's important we locate them now. Assets don't just vanish." I kept my voice steady. "Nothing has vanished." She blinked, thrown for a second, just long enough to reveal how desperately she wanted a different answer. "Well," she said, regaining her composure, "if you don't remember what he left for you, we can help you sort through it." My son nodded as if this were a reasonable offer, as if I were someone who needed help remembering. I folded the edge of the tablecloth beneath my fingers, smoothing it. A small gesture, but it kept my breath even. "Your father kept his affairs organized," I said. "If something was meant for me, he made sure I knew." Her jaw tightened. She didn't like that answer either. She pulled out the chair and sat down, crossing her legs carefully. "Look," she said, lowering her voice into something that resembled sympathy. "I know this is a difficult time, but houses, accounts, properties, they're complicated and it's easy to get overwhelmed. We just want to make sure nothing gets lost." I thought of Michael's attorney's card tucked inside my planner. I thought of the way Michael had looked at me that final week. Exhausted, yes, but certain. I thought of the quiet warning he had offered me years before. Some things, my love, are better kept untouched until the right moment. She didn't know any of this. She didn't know the conversations he and I had shared. She didn't know that the assets he protected most were safeguarded in my name long before she entered the family. My son sat beside her now, folding his hands on the table in a practiced imitation of calm. "Mom, maybe we can go through your files together," he said, "just to check." There was something pleading in his voice, something that told me he didn't fully believe her but didn't know how to stand apart from her either. He had built his marriage around her certainty, her confidence, her instructions whispered at the edges of every decision. I looked at him, really looked. The boy who used to run through this house barefoot, who once believed the world began and ended with the sound of my voice, sat before me now as a man led by someone else's will. She reached out and touched his arm. A small gesture, a reminder. Then she said, "We all benefit when things are transparent." Transparent. Yes. She wanted transparency in places she had no right to see. I stood up slowly, not abruptly, just enough to change the air in the room. Their eyes followed me as I walked to the counter and picked up my planner. I didn't open it. I didn't reveal the card inside. I simply held it. "I appreciate your concern," I said, "but your father made everything clear. I know exactly what belongs to me." The silence that followed was sharp. She rose from her chair, her smile stretched tight. "Well," she said, voice no longer sweet, "we'll talk again, sooner rather than later." She moved toward the door, my son trailing behind her like a shadow. But before stepping out, she paused and looked back at me. It wasn't suspicion anymore, it was fear. Small, flickering, but real. The moment the door closed behind them, the house settled again, and in that quiet, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not grief, but purpose. They wanted answers. They wanted access. They wanted control. But they had no idea what Michael had truly left in my hands, or how far I was willing to go to protect it. The house stayed quiet long after they left, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. This one felt alert, listening with me, taking in every thought that rose and settled inside my chest. I placed the planner on the table and sat down again, letting my hands rest flat against the wood. It was the same table Michael and I had bought when he first started his small business, long before he ever dreamed of owning offices in New York or investing in properties that would later become the backbone of our life. He used to joke that the table had heard every plan we ever made. Now it was hearing mine. I opened the planner slowly, not to read anything, just to know it was there. The card from the attorney waited quietly inside. I didn't pull it out yet. I didn't need to. The simple weight of it reminded me that I wasn't walking into this blind. Michael hadn't left me unprepared. He had left me informed, protected, and, if necessary, armed. In the late afternoon, the sunlight shifted across the floor, moving toward the hallway where Michael's study had been. I hadn't gone inside since he passed. Not because I couldn't, but because I wasn't ready to stand in a room filled with his handwriting, his books, his scent. But now, with the house stirring around me, I walked toward it. The door creaked softly when I opened it. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. His desk was still neat, the pens aligned the way he liked. The last book he'd been reading left open with a paperclip marking the page. I stepped inside and let my fingers drift across the spine of his files. He had always been meticulous. Every folder labelled, dated, categorised. He didn't hide things. He protected them. I knelt beside the bottom drawer. This was the one he always kept locked when our son and his wife visited. At the time, I thought he was simply guarding sensitive business documents, things they didn't need to see. Now I knew better. He had sensed something long before I did. When I tugged the drawer, it didn't budge. The lock clicked tight. I sat back on my heels, breathing slowly. Michael had given me a key once, years ago, tucked into a birthday card shaped like a lighthouse. For the things that matter, he'd written. I had stored it in a small jewellery box beside our bed. I rose and went to retrieve it. The key still rested in the velvet lining, colder than I remembered. When I returned to the study and slid it into the lock, it turned smoothly, too smoothly, as if it had been waiting. Inside were 3 folders. Only 3, each one thick, heavy, clearly important. I didn't pull them out. Not yet. I only sat there, taking in the fact that whatever my daughter-in-law thought she knew, whatever story she had built to convince my son I was confused or forgetful, she had no idea how deep Michael's preparations went. The first folder had my name on it, my full name. The second bore the address of a property I'd never seen before. The third simply read, "In the event." I ran my thumb over the words, feeling a warmth push through the cold knot that had settled beneath my ribs since the funeral. Michael hadn't trusted chance. He hadn't trusted assumptions. And he certainly hadn't trusted greed. I closed the drawer gently, locking it again, keeping the folders exactly where they were. Not out of fear, out of strategy. Let them think I was slow, uncertain, unaware. Let them underestimate me. When I stood up, the late light filled the room in a soft gold glow. It felt almost like a quiet nod, a reminder that grief and clarity can live side by side. I walked back into the hallway just as my phone buzzed. A message from my son. "We need to talk again tomorrow. Tomorrow." Yes, they wanted answers. But tomorrow, for the first time, I would decide how the conversation began and how it ended. The next morning arrived with a grey sky, the kind that made the neighbourhood feel smaller and quieter than usual. I sat by the window with my coffee, watching the thin branches outside sway in the early breeze. The message from my son lingered in my mind, not the words themselves, but the urgency behind them. They wanted another conversation, another attempt to guide me toward whatever conclusion they had already chosen. But now, with the folders locked away in Michael's study and the attorney's card waiting in my planner, the landscape looked different. I took my time finishing the coffee. I moved slowly through the house, opening curtains, letting in light, letting the day see me fully. In the kitchen, I placed the planner on the table, not to read it, but to know it was there, ready if I needed it. The truth rested quietly behind my fingertips. Around noon, there was another knock. 3 short taps, confident, familiar. My son, alone this time. When I opened the door, he looked tired, as if the night hadn't given him the rest he needed. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation and stood in the centre of the living room, glancing around like he wasn't sure where to begin. "Mom," he said softly, "I think we should clear this up before things get more complicated." Complicated. Yes, that was the word he had learned to use when speaking on her behalf. I nodded for him to sit. He did, leaning forward, his hands clasped together. "She's worried," he began. "We both are. Dad didn't explain much to us, and now that he's gone, we're trying to understand everything he left behind." I listened quietly. His voice wasn't harsh, it wasn't even demanding, it was uncertain, pulled between what he believed and what he'd been told to believe. His wedding ring clicked lightly against the table as he tapped his finger, a habit he'd picked up from Michael. For a moment, he looked like the son I remembered. "Mom," he continued, "are you sure there weren't documents? Transfers? Something Dad asked you to handle?" I breathed in slowly. "Your father trusted me," I said. "He handled things directly with the people he needed to." He swallowed. "That's what worries us." I raised an eyebrow. "Why would that worry you?" His answer didn't come immediately. He stared at his hands, then finally said, "Because if he left something important, we should know. We're family." Family. A word that had grown thinner every time she used it. I let the silence widen just enough for him to feel it. "Your father made choices," I said gently, "and those choices were deliberate." He exhaled, frustrated but trying not to show it. "She thinks..." He paused, searching for a softer phrase, but none came. "She thinks you might be overwhelmed, that maybe he told you things you misunderstood." I looked at him steadily. His eyes faltered. Michael's study flashed in my mind, the locked drawer, the folders labelled in his handwriting. My name on the first folder, bold and unmistakable. "Son," I said, "what exactly are you afraid I misunderstood?" He didn't answer. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably, his shoulders tensing the same way they used to when he got caught lying about homework. Old habits never fully faded. I stood, moved to the counter and picked up the planner. I didn't open it. I simply held it at my side, letting him see that I wasn't empty-handed. His eyes followed the movement, curious, uncertain. "Your father took care of me," I said quietly, "even now." He blinked. A small flicker of confusion passed through him, confusion mixed with something else. Recognition, maybe. Before he could speak again, another knock echoed sharply through the house. Not gentle, not unsure. Hers. My son looked toward the door instinctively, his posture straightening. He stood up too quickly, as if pulled by an invisible thread. I stayed still. She opened the door without waiting for either of us. Her eyes landed on the planner in my hand first. Not my face, not my son, the planner. "Good," she said with a tight smile. "We can finally settle this." But she didn't know the truth. She didn't know what was locked in Michael's study. She didn't know that this time I wasn't the one unprepared. I placed the planner gently on the table and met her gaze with a calm she wasn't expecting. "Actually," I said, "we can." She stepped farther into the room as if the house were an extension of her confidence. My son hovered behind her, torn between concern and loyalty, the kind that had more to do with routine than conviction. She pulled out a chair and sat without being invited, crossing one leg over the other, adjusting her sleeve like she was preparing for a negotiation she assumed she'd already won. "Let's start simple," she said. "Show us what you have." I looked at her calmly, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. She expected panic or confusion, maybe even obedience, but I offered none of it. "What exactly are you asking for?" I said. She let out a quiet breath, the kind people take when they think they're being patient with someone who doesn't understand. "Any documents, anything your husband left, we can help you sort it." My son nodded, echoing her words. "It'll be easier for everyone," he murmured. I watched him carefully. He wasn't trying to deceive me, not consciously. He was repeating lines someone else had handed him, word for word. I could almost see the moments between them, her voice firm, his uncertainty softening under her certainty. I lifted the planner slightly, enough for both of them to see it. Her eyes sharpened immediately, her posture tightening. "There we are," she said. "Let's take a look." I placed it back on the table. Closed. Unmoved. "This," I said, "isn't for you." Her smile cracked, not shattered, but split just enough for the truth to show through. "You don't understand how estate matters work," she said. "Things your husband left behind involve all of us." "No," I said quietly. "They involve me." My son shifted. "Mom," I didn't look away from her. "Your father knew exactly what he was doing." For the first time since stepping inside, she faltered. The moment was brief, but unmistakable. A pulse of uncertainty flickered through her expression. Then came the tightening of her jaw, the recalculation. She leaned forward. "If you refuse to cooperate," she said slowly, "you're putting yourself at risk, financially and legally. Mistakes can be costly. Costly. Yes." She liked that word. She used it often, always in the context of me being the burden. I rose from my chair, and the movement shifted the entire room. She stiffened. My son looked between us, caught in a current he didn't understand. "There are no mistakes here," I said. "Not on my part." Her fingers curled slightly around the arm of the chair, as if gripping something invisible. "Then show us the documents," she said. Simple. Simple again. Simple meaning, surrender the information, surrender the control. I reached for the planner, opening it just enough for the edges of paper to be visible, but not enough for them to see what lay inside. Her eyes widened, not in triumph, but in fear of the unknown. She had built her certainty on the belief that I had nothing, that Michael had left her a clear path. But she didn't know Michael, not the way I did, not the way he planned. "My affairs," I said slowly, "are in order, and they're protected." My son exhaled sharply, not angry, overwhelmed. "Mom, what does that mean?" "It means," I said, closing the planner, "your father left instructions. For me." Her lips parted, ready to fire back, but she couldn't find the right words. Not when she didn't yet know what she was fighting. I stepped away from the table and placed the planner on the counter, close enough for them to see I wasn't hiding, far enough to remind them it wasn't theirs. She stood abruptly. "We'll come back," she said, her voice tight. "And next time you need to be ready to cooperate." I met her eyes, steady, unshaken. "I already am." She turned toward the door, her steps sharper than before, the confidence she arrived with slipping around the edges. My son lingered a moment longer, watching me as if trying to reconcile the mother he thought he knew with the woman standing in front of him now. "Mom," he whispered, "please don't make this harder." I looked at him gently. Harder for who? He had no answer. When the door finally closed behind them, the house didn't feel quiet. It felt aligned, ready. Their story was unraveling. And mine, Michael's, was just beginning to unfold. The house felt steady the next morning, almost as if it had settled into the same decision I had. I woke before sunrise, the air still cool, the sky outside a soft grey that hadn't yet decided what kind of day it wanted to be. I moved quietly through the kitchen, letting the familiar routine guide my hands. Coffee, a small plate, the sound of the spoon against ceramic. Everything felt ordinary, but nothing was ordinary anymore. I took the planner from the counter and placed it beside me at the table. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Its presence was enough, a reminder that Michael had prepared me for exactly this moment. While they believed I was confused, overwhelmed, or forgetful, the truth waited patiently beneath a simple leather cover. By mid-morning, the phone rang. Not my son, someone else. A voice I recognized immediately. Michael's attorney. He spoke gently at first, offering condolences again, checking in. Then, after a pause, he said, "It seems there have been inquiries about your late husband's assets." Inquiries. Plural. Persistent. I breathed slowly. "From who?" Another pause. "Your son's wife contacted the office." More than once. My fingers tightened around the edge of the table. She had gone around me, not because she thought it was right, but because she believed she had leverage. "She said," the attorney continued, "you were having difficulty locating certain documents, that you might need assistance managing the estate." I closed my eyes briefly. That was her narrative. The same one she had repeated in my home. The same one she had wrapped around my son until he couldn't tell where her fear ended and his concern began. I told her, the attorney went on, that any estate matters involving your husband could only be discussed with his designated beneficiary. He paused again. Which is you. The room felt warmer suddenly, still quiet but alive. He cleared his throat softly. Your husband left very explicit instructions. He made decisions long before his health declined, decisions he wanted to protect you with. If you'd like to review them, I can meet with you this week. I looked toward Michael's study, the door still slightly ajar. Yes, I said. I would. After we ended the call, I sat for a long time, just listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. Grief and clarity wove themselves together again, binding me a little stronger than the day before. The afternoon passed quietly until the familiar sound of my son's car pulled into the driveway. Not hers, his alone. He walked slowly to the door, shoulders tense, expression unsure. When I opened it, he looked at me differently. Not with doubt, not with suspicion, with hesitation, and maybe concern. Mom, he said, rubbing the back of his neck, she told me you refused to cooperate yesterday. She said you wouldn't show anything. I stepped aside, letting him in. Your father handled everything, I said. I know what belongs to me, he swallowed. She thinks I know what she thinks. He exhaled shakily and lowered himself onto the sofa. She said if we don't get ahead of this, we could lose out on... Well, she didn't say exactly, but she's nervous. Nervous. Good. I sat across from him. Your father left instructions with his attorney, I said. Clear ones. His eyes lifted. Confusion flickered through them. Real confusion, not the kind shaped by someone else's words. Instructions? What kind? I didn't answer directly. Instead, I said, your father trusted me. He looked down at his hands, the silence stretching between us. For the first time in weeks, I saw my son. Not the man repeating her lines, but the boy I raised, sitting with a truth he hadn't been expecting. Mom, he whispered, is there something I should know? I let the moment settle. Then I said, there are things your father planned for me, and they are mine to handle. He nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of it, trying to anchor himself in a story he'd only seen fragments of. Before he could speak again, another car pulled up outside. Again. He stood quickly, tense now, as if bracing himself for the storm he'd helped invite into our home. But this time, I wasn't bracing. I was ready. Whatever she planned to confront me with today, she was already too late. The truth, the real truth, was no longer something she could manipulate, twist, or claim. It was in my hands, exactly where Michael intended it to be. She entered without waiting, her steps sharp, her expression already set in the shape of accusation. My son rose from the sofa as if pulled upward by her arrival. She barely looked at him. Her eyes went straight to me, then to the planner still resting on the table. The same calculation flickered through her face, the one I'd seen growing every day, the fear of losing something she had never possessed. We need to talk, she said. Her voice was calm, but only on the surface. Beneath it, urgency trembled. This situation is getting out of hand. I didn't move. What situation? She blinked, surprised I wasn't giving her a path forward. The estate, she said slowly, as if explaining to a child. The assets your husband left behind. If you're withholding information, you're jeopardizing all of us. All of us. She always spoke as though she had earned a place in decisions she never contributed to. I stayed still, my hands resting lightly on the back of Michael's chair. She hated stillness. It left her nothing to push against. I spoke to the attorney, I said. The words landed like a door slamming shut. Her smile didn't fade. It froze. My son looked between us, startled. You talked to him? Yes, I answered. This morning. She stepped closer too quickly. What did he tell you? What did he tell you? That my husband made his decisions clearly and legally. A tight breath escaped her. She tried to cover it with a laugh, but the sound didn't reach her eyes. Well, of course he did, she said, but that doesn't mean you understood everything correctly. I understood enough. For the first time, she hesitated. Her confidence cracked, showing the thin line of fear beneath. My son spoke quietly. Mom, what did Dad say? I met his eyes. He said things were arranged and protected. He sank back onto the sofa as if someone had pressed a hand to his chest. Understanding didn't come all at once. It came in waves, small and soft, loosening the knots she had tied around him. She turned to him sharply. Don't listen to that. We don't even know what she means. This is exactly why we need the documents, so nothing gets misinterpreted. She doesn't need to interpret anything, I said. Your father left the attorney explicit written instructions. He followed them. Her face went pale, not white, ashen, the exact colour someone turns when they realise the ground beneath them wasn't solid, just painted to look like it. She pointed at the planner. Then show us, she demanded. If everything is so clear, show us what he left. I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, no. My son closed his eyes, exhaling a breath that sounded like surrender. She stiffened. You don't have the right to refuse. I have every right, I said softly. The room shifted then, not dramatically, not loudly. In the smallest way, subtle, certain, like a boat that stops drifting and finds its anchor. She glared at me, searching for the weak spot she had always relied on. But grief hadn't hollowed me out, it had sharpened me. You're making a mistake, she whispered. No, I replied. I'm following my husband's instructions. My son leaned forward. What instructions? I stepped away from the chair, my back straight, my breath steady. The attorney will explain the rest when I meet with him. Her eyes widened, not in shock, but in dread. She finally understood. She wasn't part of the meeting. She wasn't part of the plan. She wasn't part of anything Michael valued. She spun toward the door, grabbing her purse with hands that shook more than she meant them to. We're not done, she hissed. I watched her leave without a word. My son followed her, slower, pausing at the doorway as if he wanted to say something. But the truth weighed too heavily now. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him. The house settled again, not lighter, not heavier, just aligned with the truth. Michael had trusted me, and soon the world he built would show exactly how much. She didn't return that evening, and for the first time in weeks, the house felt completely my own. I moved through it slowly, turning off lights one by one, letting the quiet settle into the corners where fear had once tried to root itself. By morning, I felt steady, grounded in a way I hadn't since Michael first went into the hospital. His instructions were no longer a mystery. They had become a direction. Before noon, the attorney called again. I reviewed your husband's file, he said. There's something you should see in person. His tone was careful, respectful, the kind reserved for news that carries weight. We scheduled a meeting for the next day. I spent the afternoon preparing, though not in the way they might have imagined. I didn't gather files or search for documents. Instead, I walked through Michael's study once more, touching the closed drawer, feeling the steady reassurance of its lock. The folders inside sat untouched, exactly where they needed to be. Their presence alone told me everything. Whatever was coming next, I wasn't walking into it empty-handed. As I stood in the doorway, the phone vibrated again, this time a message from my son. She wants to talk again tonight. We'll stop by. Not can we? Not are you available? Just a statement. A plan already made without me. I replied with a single word. Okay. When they arrived, the sun was beginning to set. My son walked in first, his expression heavy, as though he'd aged overnight. She followed close behind, her steps stiff, her confidence thinner than before. She scanned the living room quickly, eyes darting to the planner, then to my face, searching for the weakness she used to count on. We need answers, she said immediately. No greeting, no pause. My son added, we just want clarity. Clarity, yes. Usually a request for truth. In her case, a request for control. I sat down, letting them stand. She hated anything that made her look smaller. You spoke to the attorney, she said, her voice tight. What exactly did he tell you? That my husband left instructions, I said. And that they're being followed. Her jaw clenched. That doesn't explain what you're hiding. I'm not hiding anything, I said. I'm respecting what your father arranged. My son stepped forward. Mom, does this affect us? There it was, the real question, the one she had been whispering into his ear for days, maybe weeks. Does this affect them? Meaning, will they get anything? Will they benefit? Will his father's work become theirs? I looked at him gently. Your father made decisions based on what he felt was best. For me, for himself, for the legacy he built. She scoffed. Legacy? The word came out bitter, almost mocking. What legacy? You lived modestly. There's nothing he had that would require all this secrecy. I didn't react. But her mistake was loud. She had revealed the gap in her knowledge, the blind spot Michael had intentionally left. My son frowned at her, just slightly. You don't know that. She turned sharply toward him. I've handled everything for months. Of course I know. No, I said quietly. You handled what you were allowed to see. The silence that followed reached the edges of the house. I rose slowly, my movements steady, unhurried. Tomorrow, I said, I'm meeting with the attorney. After that, everything will be clear. Her composure cracked. You can't make decisions without us. This affects me, I said, and the attorney will confirm that. My son stepped toward me, his voice softer than hers, but carrying more fear. Mom, am I going to lose something? Is that what this means? I placed a hand on his arm, the way I used to when he was small and trembling after a nightmare. You will lose nothing that belongs to you. He took in a shaky breath. She took in a sharp one. Then she said the worst thing she could have chosen in that moment. Then what belongs to us? I held her gaze, letting the truth settle where denial had been living. That, I said, is what tomorrow will decide. Her face drained of colour. My son looked at the floor. The evening dissolved into a silence neither of them could control. When they finally left, the sky outside had darkened fully, the porch light casting the only glow across the driveway. I watched their car pull away, her silhouette rigid, his head bowed. Inside, the house felt still, almost waiting. Tomorrow would bring answers. Not for me, for them. The attorney's office sat on the 15th floor of a quiet building downtown, the kind with wide windows and soft carpet that swallowed every footstep. I arrived early, carrying nothing but the planner tucked neatly under my arm. The receptionist offered a gentle smile, then guided me to a private room with a long wooden table and sunlight pouring in from the east. It felt calm, intentionally calm, like a place built for truth. When the attorney entered, he carried a single folder, not thick, not overwhelming, just important. He sat across from me and folded his hands. Your husband prepared this years ago, he said. Everything was updated again 6 months before his passing. He slid the folder toward me, and for a moment I didn't open it. I simply rested my hand on top, feeling the finality of it, the quiet weight of everything Michael had entrusted to me. He left clear instructions, the attorney continued. All major properties, including the building in New York, were placed solely in your name. The investment accounts too. Every asset tied to his business is yours. He wanted to ensure you would never depend on anyone. The room didn't spin. My breath didn't hitch. I simply nodded, the way you do when a truth arrives exactly the way you expected it. And your son? I asked softly. He is listed as a secondary heir, the attorney said, for a separate trust your husband planned to establish in the future. But nothing places control of your assets in anyone else's hands. I closed the folder gently. It wasn't surprise that washed over me, it was clarity. A kind I hadn't felt since before the hospital rooms, before the whispered arguments between my son and his wife, before grief tried to weaken what Michael had spent a lifetime strengthening. When I left the office, the sun had broken through the clouds. The city below looked smaller, manageable, like a world I could walk through without bending. They were already waiting when I got home, my son on the porch, sitting on the top step, shoulders hunched. She stood behind him, arms crossed tightly, eyes sharp with anticipation. Well? She demanded the moment I approached. What did he say? My son looked up at me, his expression softer, almost wary. He didn't ask the way she did. He asked with the heaviness of someone bracing for something real. I stepped past them, unlocked the door and let it swing open. Come in, I said. Inside, they stood in the middle of the living room, the way guests do in a place they don't quite belong. I placed the folder on the table, opened it and turned it so they both could see. This, I said quietly, is what your father left for me. She leaned forward first, eyes darting over the documents, her face draining of colour. Inch by inch, she read the names, the signatures, the dates. She saw the clarity she had spent weeks trying to blur. No, she whispered. This can't be right. He wouldn't. He did, I replied. My son swallowed hard. Mom, is all of this really yours? Yes, I said. Your father trusted me with everything he built. He nodded slowly, the truth settling into him, heavy but steady, the kind of truth that stays. She stepped back, her voice cracking. So we get nothing? After everything I've done? After everything we've gone through? I looked at her, not with anger, not with triumph, with the calm she had mistaken for weakness. You receive exactly what was intended, I said. Nothing more, nothing less. She turned on my son. Say something. Fix this. But he didn't. For the first time, he didn't. He looked at me with a softness I hadn't seen since he was young, a softness that came from understanding instead of obligation. Mom, he said quietly, I didn't know. I'm sorry. I reached out and touched his hand. I know. She stormed out then, slamming the door behind her so hard the windows rattled. But the house didn't shake, not anymore. My son lingered a moment longer. If you ever need anything, he said, voice thin but honest, I'm still your son. I know, I whispered, and that's all I ever needed. When he finally left, the house settled into a stillness that felt earned, not lonely, not empty, peaceful. I walked to Michael's study, opened the door, and let the sunlight fall across the desk he once worked at. The lock on the drawer gleamed faintly, reflecting the morning light. I placed my hand on it, just once, acknowledging him, his planning, his faith, his love. They thought I had nothing, I murmured into the quiet. But Michael knew better, and now so did I. The story didn't end with loss. It ended with truth, protection, and the strength he left in my hands, exactly where it was always meant to be.